So they must produce fertile offspring. So fertile means that their kids would be able to produce offspring as well. If they produce infertile offspring, then their kids can't produce more offspring, so their species would die out. Okay, so variation is required for natural selection to occur. So we talked about variation in the previous slide, so this is required for natural selection to occur. So here's an image of natural selection. So for example, these two beetles there are two different colors. There's some green ones and some brown ones. So these birds here, they like the green beetles. Maybe green's their favorite color. So they pick the green beetles. So what do you think eventually would happen to these beetles, this little population of beetles? So eventually these beetles, these little birds would pick out all of the green beetles, and so only the brown ones would be left. So the brown color in this case is a favorable variation for these beetles because the birds don't like the brown ones, they just like the green ones. So eventually these brown ones would survive, and they will go on to make more brown baby beetles, and the green ones would eventually die out. So variation means that some individuals survive better in their environment. So in this case, the brown ones would survive better. If an organism can survive, it can breed more offspring like it. They mentioned, so they survive the birds eating them, and then they'll make more brown baby offspring beetles. Okay, and it's not, natural selection, it isn't about being the biggest animal or about collecting all the food or more food than another animal. It's about having favorable genetic variations. So that's important to remember. So it's not always better to be bigger or the biggest animal out there. So it's about genetic variation. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about artificial selection. So artificial selection is intentionally breeding organisms to produce desired characteristics. So there's artificial selection in animals. So for example, these dogs here. So originally dogs came from wolves, but today we breed dogs based on which one we want. So if we want Dalmatian, we breed Dalmatians with Dalmatians and get smaller Dalmatians. So there's different kind of dog breeds. And also another animal example would be cows. So sometimes we breed cows so that they can produce more milk. So we breed cows that produce a lot of milk with other cows that produce a lot of milk in hopes that we can get baby cows that would eventually produce more milk. Okay, and there's also artificial selection in plants. So these are pea plants. So Mendel's pea plants were an example of artificial selection. So he purposely bred one type of plant to another plant to see what we would come up with. So he selected these plants that he wanted to breed. So that's an example of artificial selection in plants. And there's also artificial selection in insects. So for bees, for example, we would probably breed bees so that we get the offspring bees that would produce the most honey. So that's artificial selection. Now we're going to talk about adaptation. So natural selection produces adaptations. So I said variations are needed for natural selection, and then when natural selection takes place, it produces adaptation. So adaptations is a change in the structure or behavior of an entire species that makes them better suited for their environment. So an adaptation is the whole species. It's not just one organism. So for example, the giraffe is a good example of adaptation. So we all know that giraffes have really long necks. And they have really long necks so they can reach the leaves that are up here in these trees. Okay, so a long time ago, giraffes used to have short necks. You can see here in this image, over time, their necks grew longer and longer. So here's one with a short neck, and then now they have really long necks. So that's an example of an adaptation. So these giraffes adapted to their environment because their trees that they wanted to eat from were really tall. So they needed, over time, to stretch. They needed their necks to be longer. So after many, many generations, eventually they produced tall giraffes. Because the taller giraffes survived better than the short-necked giraffes. Because if these ones can't reach the food, then they can't survive. So over many generations, their necks grew longer. And now all the giraffes have long necks. All the giraffes we see today have long necks. Okay, so who influenced Darwin? There's a few people that influenced Darwin's theory. So there's one scientist called Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And here's an image of him, of Lamarck. He was a French naturalist, so he was a naturalist like Darwin. And he was the first to say that species change over time. So he noticed the change in the giraffe before Darwin thought about it, but he was wrong about how they changed. So he thought that the traits that the parents developed in their lifetime, that they can be passed on to their offspring. But it's actually related to the genes. So just because a parent had it in their life, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to pass it to their offspring. So it's related to their genes, or genetic variation that I talked about. And another person is Thomas Malthus. And here's an image of him. He was actually an English economist. So he wasn't a scientist, but he was an economist. And he studied human populations. And he thought that populations grew faster than the resources that they need, so faster than how much food could be produced for them and how much space they needed. So he studied human populations. And he thought that diseases and famine and war, that all these things killed people, and that he thought that they keep the populations at a good number. So they would basically kill off the weak members of a population so that it can be controlled.